Have you ever stopped to think that the Bible begins with one of the biggest lies ever told? Not an intentional lie, but a translation so fundamentally wrong that it changed the course of human history for over 2,000 years. Open your Bible to Genesis 1:1. Go ahead, grab it right now. You'll see. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Simple, right? One God, one creation, one truth. But what if I told you that the original Hebrew word, translated as God, is Elohim, a plural word meaning gods or divine beings? That's right. The first line of the Bible, read correctly, should be, "In the beginning the gods created the heavens and the earth." But here's where it gets really wild. This isn't some fringe theory or modern revisionist interpretation. Hebrew scholars have known this for centuries. The word Elohim appears over 2,500 times in the Hebrew Bible, and it's grammatically plural every single time. Yet somehow, somewhere along the way, we collectively decided to pretend it meant just one God. Why? Because admitting that the Bible opens with multiple creators would shatter everything Christianity has built itself on. It would mean that from the very first verse, we've been reading a story about divine beings, plural, not the singular all-powerful deity we've been taught to worship. But the ancient Gnostics knew this secret. They understood what modern churches refuse to acknowledge, that the creation story isn't about one benevolent God bringing forth a perfect world. It's about a council of divine beings with one member who would go rogue and create a prison disguised as paradise. Think about it. If you've ever wondered why the world is filled with so much suffering, why natural disasters kill innocent people, why disease ravages children, why wars never end, you've been asking the wrong question. The question isn't, how could a loving God allow this? The question is, what if the being who created this world isn't loving at all? The Gnostics had a name for this rogue creator, Yaldabaoth, also known as the Demiurge, and according to texts, that the early Christian church tried desperately to destroy, this entity isn't just some minor player in the cosmic drama. He's the star of the show we call reality. He's the one who made this world. And he's the one billions of people pray to every Sunday, completely unaware that they're worshipping their own jailer. Now, before you dismiss this as some New Age nonsense or Dan Brown thriller plot, let me tell you something that will make your head spin. In December 1945, an Egyptian farmer named Mohammed Ali al-Saman was digging for fertilizer near the town of Nag Hammadi when he uncovered a large earthenware jar. Inside that jar were 13 leather-bound papyrus books, codices that contained 52 texts, including Gospels, treatises, and revelations that had been buried for over 1,600 years. These weren't just any old manuscripts. These were the sacred texts of the Gnostic Christians, the ones who claimed to have the secret teachings of Jesus himself, the ones who said they knew the real story behind creation, behind the fall, behind the purpose of human existence, the ones who were systematically hunted down and eliminated by the Roman Church in the 4th century. And what did these texts reveal? They told a story so shocking, so fundamentally different from the version we've been taught, that it's taken scholars 70 years just to begin processing the implications. According to the Gnostic texts, the God of the Old Testament, the one who demands sacrifice, who sends plagues, who orders genocide, who gets jealous and angry, isn't the true God at all. He's a delusional, ignorant being who created this material world as a trap for divine souls. He's so arrogant and blind that he actually believes he's the only God in existence. But here's the part that'll keep you up at night. Every single characteristic attributed to this false god in the Gnostic texts matches perfectly with the behavior of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. The jealousy, the wrath, the demand for exclusive worship, the tendency to punish entire populations for the crimes of a few. It's all there. The Gnostics weren't just making this up. They were reading the same texts we read today, but with eyes that weren't blinded by institutional dogma. They saw what was hidden in plain sight, that the creator of this world displays every characteristic of what we would typically call evil. And Jesus? According to the Gnostic Gospels, he didn't come to earth to die for our sins or to reconcile us with the Creator. He came to wake us up from the illusion that this world and its creator are worthy of our worship. He came to remind us that we are divine beings who have been tricked into forgetting our true nature. But the church couldn't let this interpretation survive. Why? Because it would mean that everything they built their power on was false. It would mean that instead of needing priests and churches and rituals to connect with God, people could access the divine directly. It would mean that salvation doesn't come from faith in an external savior, but from awakening to the divine spark that already exists within each of us. So they did what authoritarian institutions always do when faced with threatening information. They destroyed it. They burned the books, killed the teachers, and created a new version of Christianity that made people dependent on institutional authority rather than encouraging them to seek direct spiritual experience. For 16 centuries, they succeeded. The Gnostic texts were gone, their ideas seemingly erased from history. The only references to Gnosticism that survived were the attacks written by their enemies, church fathers, who painted them as heretics and deviants. But truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried in the Egyptian desert. And now, for the first time in over a millennium and a half, we can read these texts for ourselves. We can see what the early church was so desperate to hide. We can ask the questions that have been forbidden for 2,000 years. Questions like, what if the serpent in the Garden of Eden was actually trying to help humanity by offering knowledge? What if the fruit wasn't forbidden by a loving God, but by a jealous tyrant who wanted to keep humans ignorant? What if the flood wasn't divine justice, but the tantrum of a petulant deity who couldn't handle the fact that his creation was becoming too wise? These aren't just academic questions, they're personal ones. Because if the Gnostics were right, it means that every prayer you've ever said, every moment of worship, every act of religious devotion may have been directed toward the very being who is responsible for your spiritual imprisonment. It means that the voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you're inherently sinful, that you need to submit to external authority, that voice isn't coming from God. It's coming from the entity that created this world to keep you trapped in ignorance and fear. But it also means something else, something that might be the most hopeful message in human history. It means that you are not a fallen creature in need of salvation. You are a divine being who has temporarily forgotten your true nature. You don't need to be saved. You need to be awakened. The question is, are you ready to wake up? Are you prepared to consider that everything you've been taught about God, about creation, about the purpose of existence might not just be wrong, but deliberately misleading? Because once you start down this path, there's no going back. Once you see the truth hidden in plain sight in the pages of your own Bible, you can't unsee it. Once you understand what the Gnostics knew and died to preserve, you become part of a chain of knowledge that stretches back 2,000 years. The choice is yours. You can close this book, dismiss these ideas as heretical nonsense, and continue living in the comfortable illusion that has sustained humanity for centuries. Or you can take the next step into a mystery that goes deeper than you ever imagined, a mystery that reveals the true nature of reality itself. Picture this. It's 391 CE and you're standing in the Great Library of Alexandria, watching the greatest collection of human knowledge go up in flames. Christian mobs, acting on orders from Emperor Theodosius I, are systematically destroying every scroll, every codex, every piece of parchment that doesn't align with the newly established Orthodox faith. This isn't just book burning. This is the systematic erasure of alternative ways of understanding reality, spirituality, and the divine. Among the texts being destroyed are hundreds of Gnostic writings, Gospels, treatises, and revelations that told a radically different story about Jesus, creation, and the nature of existence itself. But some of those texts didn't burn. Some were rescued by monks and scholars who understood that they were holding something precious, something that future generations might need to rediscover. These texts were carefully wrapped, placed in sealed jars and buried in the Egyptian desert, where they would remain hidden for over 1,600 years. What those ancient preservers couldn't have known was that they were saving the pieces of a puzzle that would eventually reveal the most shocking truth in human history, that the God most people worship is not the true God at all, but but a counterfeit deity who has been masquerading as the divine for millennia. When Muhammad Ali al-Saman cracked open that jar in 1945, he wasn't just discovering ancient manuscripts. He was unleashing a revelation that would shake the foundations of Christianity itself. Among the texts he found was one called the Apocryphon of John, a secret gospel that claims to contain the true teachings of Jesus revealed to his disciple John in a vision. And what does this text reveal? It tells the story of Sophia, one of the divine emanations from the true God, who in her eagerness to create something beautiful, accidentally gives birth to a malformed entity. This entity, born from Sophia's good intentions but lacking the spark of true divinity, becomes consumed with jealousy and arrogance. His name is Yaldabaoth, and he is about to become the most consequential figure in human history, even though most people have never heard of him. Yaldabaoth is described in the Gnostic texts as a being of terrible appearance, sometimes a serpent, sometimes a lion, always with eyes like burning coals. But his physical form is less important than his psychological profile. He is jealous, wrathful, ignorant, and above all delusional. He believes himself to be the only God in existence, completely unaware that he is merely a flawed creation of a higher divine being. And what does this delusional entity do with his newfound power? He creates a world, not a perfect world, but a flawed reflection of the divine realm above. He creates matter, time, death, and suffering. He creates a prison designed to trap fragments of divine consciousness, what the Gnostics called the pneuma, or divine spark, inside physical bodies. But here's where the story gets personal. According to the Gnostic texts, you and I are not just random products of evolution or divine creation. We are divine beings who have been tricked into forgetting our true nature. We are literally gods who have been convinced we are merely human. Yaldabaoth's greatest trick wasn't creating the material world. It was convincing the divine sparks trapped within that world that they belonged there. He convinced them that they were sinful, fallen, in need of salvation from an external source. He convinced them that their feelings of alienation and longing for something greater were evidence of their unworthiness rather than proof of their divine origin. Now, if you're thinking this sounds like something out of the Matrix, you're absolutely right. The Wachowski sisters have acknowledged that the film is heavily influenced by Gnostic themes. The idea that reality is an illusion, that we are trapped in a false world created by a malevolent intelligence, that awakening to the truth is both possible and necessary. These are fundamentally Gnostic concepts. But unlike the relatively recent fiction of the Matrix, these ideas are 2,000 years old. The Gnostics weren't influenced by modern philosophy or science fiction. They were claiming to have received this knowledge directly from Jesus himself. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Gnostic texts don't just describe Yaldabaoth's creation of the material world. They describe his ongoing involvement in human affairs. According to these writings, Yaldabaoth is the deity who speaks to Moses from the burning bush, who gives the 10 Commandments, who demands sacrifice and exclusive worship. In other words, the Gnostics identified Yaldabaoth with Yahweh, the God of the Hebrew Bible. But they didn't see this as a revelation of the true God. They saw it as the interference of a false god who was trying to keep humanity trapped in ignorance and subservience. This interpretation suddenly makes sense of all the troubling passages in the Old Testament that have puzzled theologians for centuries. Why does God seem so angry and jealous? Why does he demand the slaughter of entire populations? Why does he seem to change his mind and contradict himself? Why does he seem more interested in worship and obedience than in love and compassion? The Gnostic answer is simple, because the entity speaking isn't the true God. It's Yaldabaoth, the demiurge, the false creator who is so insecure about his own illegitimate authority that he demands constant validation and submission. But the Gnostics didn't just identify the problem. They also claimed to know the solution. According to their texts, the true God, the ineffable, perfect source of all existence, was aware of what had happened. Divine sparks had been trapped in Yaldabaoth's flawed creation, and they needed to be awakened and freed. So the true God sent an emissary, not to die for humanity's sins, but to wake humanity up to its true nature, not to reconcile people with their Creator, but to help them realize that their creator was a fraud. That emissary, according to the Gnostic texts, was Jesus, but not the Jesus of Orthodox Christianity. This was a Jesus who came to earth not to establish a church or to create a new religion, but to share the secret knowledge, the gnosis, that could free divine souls from their material prison. The Gnostic Jesus doesn't die on the cross to appease an angry God. He reveals the truth about the nature of reality, shows people how to access the divine spark within themselves, and then returns to the realm of true divinity, leaving behind disciples who understand that salvation doesn't come from faith in an external savior, but from awakening to their own divine nature. This is why the early church was so threatened by Gnostic Christianity. It wasn't just that the Gnostics had different beliefs. It was that their beliefs made the entire institutional structure of Christianity unnecessary. If people could access the divine directly, if salvation came from inner awakening rather than external authority, if the God of the Old Testament was actually the enemy rather than the ally of human flourishing, then what need was there for priests, churches, or religious hierarchies? The answer, from the perspective of those who had built their power on religious authority, was that there was no need at all, which is why they had to destroy Gnosticism completely, not just defeat it intellectually, but erase it from history, so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even know it had existed. For 16 centuries they succeeded. The Gnostic texts were gone. Their ideas survived only in fragments and in the attacks written by their enemies. Christianity developed into exactly what the Gnostics had warned against, an institutional religion that kept people dependent on external authority rather than encouraging them to seek direct spiritual experience. But those buried texts in the Egyptian desert were waiting. They were waiting for a time when humanity would be ready to hear the truth again, when people would be sophisticated enough to separate spiritual insight from institutional control, when the tools of scholarship and translation would be advanced enough to make these ancient texts accessible to ordinary people. That time is now. For the first time in over a millennium and a half, you can read the Gnostic texts for yourself. You can see what the early church was so desperate to hide. You can compare the Gnostic version of Jesus' teachings with the Orthodox version and decide for yourself which one resonates more deeply with your own spiritual intuition. But be warned, this knowledge comes with a price. Once you understand what the Gnostics knew, you can't unknow it. Once you see the connections between their descriptions of Yaldabaoth and the behavior of the biblical God, you can't unsee them. Once you realize that the voice of authority that has shaped Western civilization for 2 millennia might actually be the voice of humanity's spiritual captor, you can't unhear it. The question is, are you ready to pay that price? Are you prepared to let go of the comfortable certainties that have guided human civilization for centuries? Are you willing to consider that the most radical spiritual revolution in human history might be found not in some new teaching, but in the recovery of ancient wisdom that was buried in the desert 2,000 years ago? Because that's exactly what we're about to explore. We're about to see how the Gnostic understanding of Yaldabaoth doesn't just explain the troubling passages in the Old Testament, it explains the entire structure of reality as we experience it. We're about to discover that the connections between ancient Gnostic texts and modern experience go deeper than anyone imagined. The texts are no longer buried. The truth is no longer hidden. The only question is whether you have the courage to see it. What I'm about to show you will change everything you thought you knew about the Bible, about God, and about the nature of reality itself. I'm going to put 2 texts side by side, one from the Hebrew Bible that billions of people consider to be the Word of God, and one from the Gnostic texts that the early church tried to destroy. And when you see them together, you'll understand why the church was so desperate to keep this knowledge from reaching the masses. Let's start with Isaiah 45:7, a verse that has puzzled theologians for centuries. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and create evil. I, the Lord, do all these things. Now here's what the Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of John, says about Yaldabaoth. He is the one who creates both good and evil, light and darkness, peace and war. He believes himself to be the only God, but he is ignorant of the true source of all existence. Do you see it? The exact same claim, the exact same character traits, the exact same divine confession of creating both good and evil. But this is just the beginning. Let's look at Exodus 25, where God describes himself as a jealous God. The Hebrew word used here is kana, which means possessive jealousy, the kind of jealousy that drives someone to violence and revenge. Compare that to the Gnostic description of Yaldabaoth from On the Origin of the World. He was jealous and wanted to create something that would be his alone. His jealousy blinded him to the true nature of divinity. Again, the same characteristic, the same admission of jealousy, the same possessive nature. But here's where it gets really disturbing. In 1 Samuel 15:3, God commands the Israelites to attack the Amalekites and totally destroy all that belongs to them. Do not spare them. Put to death men and women, children and infants, cattle and sheep, camels and donkeys. This isn't just warfare. This is genocide, the systematic extermination of an entire people, including babies and animals. And it's being commanded by the entity that Christians worship as the source of all love and goodness. Now look at what the Gnostic text, The Reality of the Rulers, says about Yaldabaoth. He is a murderer from the beginning. He delights in death and destruction. He commands his servants to destroy those who oppose him, showing no mercy to the innocent. The pattern is undeniable. Every negative characteristic attributed to Yaldabaoth in the Gnostic texts appears in the behavior of Yahweh in the Hebrew Bible. The jealousy, the wrath, the demand for exclusive worship, the tendency to punish entire populations for the crimes of a few, the apparent pleasure in violence and destruction, it's all there. But surely this is just coincidence, right? Surely the Gnostics were just reading their own prejudices into the biblical text. Here's the thing. The Gnostics weren't approaching the Bible as outsiders. They were Jewish and Christian scholars who knew the Hebrew and Greek texts intimately. They weren't ignorant peasants making up stories. They were sophisticated theologians who had access to traditions and interpretations that were later suppressed by the Orthodox Church. And they noticed something that modern Christians have been trained to ignore. The God of the Hebrew Bible doesn't act like a supremely good being. He acts like exactly what the Gnostics said he was, a powerful but flawed entity who is ignorant of his own true nature and jealous of any challenge to his authority. Consider the story of Job. God allows Satan to torture an innocent man, killing his children and destroying his health, just to win a bet about human loyalty. What kind of supremely good being would do such a thing? The Gnostic answer, the kind who isn't supremely good at all, but is actually a jealous, insecure entity who values obedience over justice. Or consider the story of Abraham and Isaac. God commands Abraham to sacrifice his own son, then stops him at the last moment. Orthodox Christianity sees this as a test of faith. The Gnostics saw it as the behavior of a sadistic entity who delights in psychological torture. Or consider the plagues of Egypt. God doesn't just free the Israelites from slavery. He systematically tortures the entire Egyptian population, including children and animals who had nothing to do with the enslavement. He hardens Pharaoh's heart to prevent him from releasing the Israelites, then punishes him for not releasing them. This isn't justice. This is the behavior of a being who enjoys inflicting suffering. The Gnostics looked at these stories and saw a pattern that Orthodox Christianity refuses to acknowledge. The God of the Hebrew Bible consistently acts in ways that would be considered evil if done by a human being. He lies, he breaks his promises, he punishes the innocent, he rewards the wicked. He demands worship through fear rather than inspiring it through love. But here's what makes this revelation even more shocking. The Gnostics didn't just identify Yaldabaoth with the God of the Hebrew Bible. They provided an explanation for why this entity behaves the way he does. According to their texts, Yaldabaoth is not evil by nature. He is evil by ignorance. The Gnostic text, The Hypostasis of the Archons, explains, the chief ruler is blind. Because of his power and his ignorance and his arrogance, he said with his power, I am God, there is none beside me. For he is ignorant of his strength, of the place from which he had come. This is perhaps the most psychologically sophisticated explanation for the behavior of the biblical God ever proposed. Yaldabaoth isn't maliciously evil. He's pathologically narcissistic. He's a powerful being who lacks the wisdom to understand his own limitations, and his ignorance makes him dangerous. Think about it in modern psychological terms. What do we call someone who demands constant praise, who cannot tolerate criticism, who punishes those who question his authority, who takes credit for everything good and blames others for everything bad, who sees himself as the center of the universe and everyone else as extensions of his will? We call that person a narcissist. And according to the Gnostic texts, that's exactly what Yaldabaoth is. A cosmic narcissist who has convinced himself that he is the only God in existence. But the Gnostics didn't just identify the problem. They also explained how this situation came about. According to their creation myth, Yaldabaoth was created by Sophia, one of the divine emanations from the true God. But Sophia created him without the consent or knowledge of her divine consort, and as a result, Yaldabaoth was born incomplete, powerful but lacking wisdom, creative but lacking understanding. This is why the material world he creates is flawed. It's not because he's intentionally evil, but because he's fundamentally ignorant. He doesn't understand the true nature of divinity, so he can't create a truly divine world. He can only create a distorted reflection of the divine realm, a world that contains both good and evil, light and darkness, life and death. And because he's ignorant of his own origins, he believes himself to be the ultimate source of all existence. He proclaims himself to be the only God, demands exclusive worship, and becomes violently jealous when challenged. He's not lying when he claims to be God. He genuinely believes it. But his belief is based on ignorance, not knowledge. This understanding suddenly makes sense of all the contradictions in the Hebrew Bible. Why does God seem to change his mind? Because he's not omniscient. Why does he seem to learn from his mistakes? Because he's not perfect. Why does he seem surprised by human behavior? Because he's not all-knowing. The Orthodox Christian response to these contradictions has always been to claim that God's ways are mysterious, that human beings can't understand divine logic, that what appears to be contradiction is actually part of some greater plan. But the Gnostic response is much simpler. What appears to be contradiction is actually contradiction, because the entity speaking isn't the true God at all. This revelation doesn't just change how we read the Bible, it changes how we understand the entire structure of reality. If the Gnostics were right, then the world we live in is not the creation of a perfect God, but the flawed creation of an ignorant demiurge. The suffering we see around us isn't part of some mysterious divine plan. It's the natural result of a flawed creation by a flawed creator. But here's the most important part. If Yaldabaoth is not the true God, then his authority over us is illegitimate. The guilt he imposes, the fear he instills, the demand for submission he makes, none of it is justified. We don't owe him obedience. We don't need his forgiveness. We don't have to accept his version of reality. According to the Gnostic texts, this is exactly what Jesus came to earth to reveal. Not that we need salvation from a loving God, but that we need liberation from a false God. Not that we should have faith in external authority, but that we should awaken to the divine authority within ourselves. The Jesus of the Gnostic Gospels doesn't die to appease God's wrath. He reveals the truth about God's identity. He doesn't establish a church to mediate between humanity and the divine. He teaches people how to access the divine directly. He doesn't promise rewards in the afterlife for obedience in this life. He offers awakening in this life to those who are ready to see the truth, but this message was too dangerous for the institutional church to tolerate. If people realized that they didn't need priests or churches or religious hierarchies to connect with the divine, the entire structure of religious authority would collapse. If people understood that the God they were worshipping was actually their spiritual captor, the foundation of Western civilization would crumble. So the church did what it had to do. It branded the Gnostics as heretiae. Everything you thought you knew about Jesus is about to change. Not just details about his life or teachings, but the fundamental nature of who he was and why he came to earth. Because according to the Gnostic texts that survived 16 centuries, buried in the Egyptian desert, Jesus wasn't who the church has told you he was. He wasn't the son of the God of the Hebrew Bible. He was the enemy of that God. Let me show you something from the Gnostic text called the Second Treatise of the Great Seth. In this document, Jesus himself speaks about his mission on earth, and what he says will shatter everything you've been taught about Christianity. I did not die in reality but in appearance, lest I be put to shame by them, because these are my kinsfolk. I removed the shame from me, and I did not become faint-hearted in the face of what happened to me at their hands. I was about to succumb to fear, and I suffered according to their sight and thought, in order that they might never find any word to speak about them. For my death, which they think happened to them in their error and blindness. This isn't the Jesus of Orthodox Christianity, who died on the cross to appease his Father's wrath. This is a Jesus who says he didn't actually die at all, but only appeared to die. A Jesus who speaks of them, the creators of this world, as his enemies, not his family. But it gets even more radical. In another Gnostic text, the Apocryphon of John, Jesus reveals the true purpose of his mission. He didn't come to earth to establish a church or to create a new religion. He came to wake people up to the truth about their situation. He came to reveal that the God they were worshipping was actually their captor, and that they themselves were divine beings who had been tricked into forgetting their true nature. Here's what the Gnostic Jesus says about Yaldabaoth. It is he who said, "I am God, there is none beside me," for he is ignorant of his strength, of the place from which he had come. And when he saw the multitude of angels which had been created by him, he became lifted up over them. Do you see what's happening? Here, the Gnostic Jesus is exposing Yaldabaoth as a fraud. He's revealing that the entity who claims to be the only God is actually an ignorant, arrogant being who doesn't even understand his own origins. But Jesus doesn't just expose the problem, he also provides the solution. According to the Gnostic texts, Jesus came to earth carrying something that Yaldabaoth couldn't create and couldn't understand: gnosis, true knowledge, direct spiritual insight that bypasses all external authority and connects the individual consciousness directly with the divine source. This is why the Gnostic Jesus doesn't establish a church. Churches are institutions that mediate between people and the divine. But gnosis is immediate, direct, personal. It can't be institutionalized because it transforms the individual from within. It can't be controlled because it comes from the true God, not from Yaldabaoth. The Gnostic text, the Gospel of Thomas, captures this perfectly. In saying 77, Jesus declares, "I am the light that is over all things, I am all. From me all came forth, and to me all attained. Split a piece of wood, I am there. Lift up the stone, and you will find me there." This isn't a claim to be the unique Son of God. This is a revelation that divine consciousness permeates all of reality, and that awakening to this truth is available to everyone. Jesus isn't saying, "Worship me." He's saying, "Become like me." In saying 108 of the same text, Jesus tells his disciple, "Whoever drinks from my mouth will become like me. I myself shall become that person, and the hidden things will be revealed to him." This is the opposite of Orthodox Christianity. Instead of creating a hierarchy with Jesus at the top and everyone else as servants, the Gnostic Jesus is offering to share his divine nature with anyone who is ready to receive it. Instead of demanding worship, he's offering partnership. Instead of creating dependence, he's offering liberation. But here's where the story gets really intense. According to the Gnostic texts, Yaldabaoth recognized Jesus as a threat from the moment he arrived, not because Jesus was challenging human authority, but because Jesus was challenging Yaldabaoth's authority over human consciousness. The Gnostic text, the Treatise on the Resurrection, explains, "Do not think the resurrection is an illusion. It is no illusion, but it is truth. Indeed, it is more fitting to say that the world is an illusion rather than the resurrection." This is a complete inversion of Orthodox Christian teaching. The Gnostic Jesus isn't saying that his resurrection proves the reality of the physical world. He's saying that his resurrection proves the illusion of the physical world. He's demonstrating that divine consciousness is not bound by the laws of matter, time, and death that govern Yaldabaoth's creation. But Yaldabaoth couldn't allow this demonstration to succeed. If people realized that they could transcend the limitations of the material world, his control over them would be broken. So he did what he always does when faced with a challenge to his authority. He tried to destroy it. The Gnostic texts describe the crucifixion not as a sacrifice demanded by God, but as an attack by Yaldabaoth on the divine messenger who had come to liberate humanity. But because Jesus was sent by the true God, not created by Yaldabaoth, the attack failed. Jesus couldn't be truly killed because he was never truly alive in the material sense. He was divine consciousness, temporarily manifesting in physical form. This is why the Gnostic Jesus can say he didn't really die. From his perspective, the crucifixion was just Yaldabaoth's futile attempt to destroy something that couldn't be destroyed. It was like trying to kill a hologram or destroy a reflection. The image might disappear, but the source remains untouched. But here's the most important part. According to the Gnostic texts, Jesus' mission didn't end with his apparent death. It just moved to a new phase. Instead of teaching openly to large crowds, he began revealing the deepest mysteries to his most advanced disciples. And what he revealed was a step-by-step process for escaping from Yaldabaoth's prison. The Gnostic text Pistis Sophia describes Jesus spending 11 years after his resurrection teaching his disciples about the structure of reality, the nature of consciousness, and the techniques for achieving liberation from the material world. These weren't just philosophical discussions. They were practical instructions for spiritual transformation. Jesus taught his disciples how to recognize the voice of the true God within themselves. He showed them how to distinguish between the promptings of divine consciousness and the deceptions of Yaldabaoth. He gave them techniques for accessing higher states of consciousness that would allow them to see through the illusions of the material world. Most importantly, he taught them that salvation doesn't come from believing in him as an external savior, but from awakening to the same divine consciousness that he embodied. He wasn't offering to save them from their sins. He was offering to teach them how to save themselves by recognizing their own divine nature. This is why the Orthodox Church had to destroy Gnosticism, not because it was false, but because it was too true. It revealed that the entire structure of institutional Christianity was unnecessary. If people could access the divine directly, if salvation came from inner awakening rather than external authority, if the God of the Hebrew Bible was actually the enemy of human spiritual development, then what need was there for priests, churches, or religious hierarchies? The answer, from the perspective of those who had built their power on religious authority, was that there was no need at all, which is why they didn't just defeat Gnosticism intellectually. They destroyed it physically. They burned the books, killed the teachers, and created a new version of Christianity that made people dependent on institutional authority rather than encouraging them to seek direct spiritual experience. But the truth has a way of surviving, even when it's buried in the desert for 16 centuries. And now, for the first time since the 4th century, we can read these texts for ourselves and decide whether the Gnostic interpretation of Jesus makes more sense than the Orthodox one. The Gnostic Jesus doesn't ask for your faith. He asks for your awakening. He doesn't demand your worship. He offers you partnership in the divine consciousness that he embodied. He doesn't promise you rewards in the afterlife for obedience in this life. He offers you liberation in this life from the illusions that keep you trapped. But this liberation comes with a price. Once you understand what Jesus was really teaching, you can't go back to the comfortable certainties of Orthodox Christianity. Once you realize that the God you were taught to worship is actually your spiritual captor, you can't unknow it. Once you see that salvation doesn't come from external authority, but from inner awakening, you can't unsee it. The choice is yours. You can continue living in the comfortable illusion that has sustained humanity for centuries, or you can accept the challenge that Jesus offered to his original disciples to awaken to your own divine nature and join him in the work of liberating human consciousness from the prison of ignorance. The texts are available. The teachings are clear. The techniques are described. The only question is whether you have the courage to follow where they lead. Because once you step onto the path of gnosis, there's no going back. Once you begin to see through the illusions of the material world, you can't unsee them. Once you start to awaken to your own divine nature, you can't go back to sleep. The climax of the story isn't Jesus. So here we are, at the end of a journey that began with a simple question about a Hebrew word and has taken us through the deepest mysteries of existence itself. We've discovered that the God most people worship may not be God at all, that the Jesus most people follow may have been teaching something completely different from what they've been told, and that the reality most people accept may be nothing more than an elaborate illusion. The question now is, what do you do with this knowledge? Because let's be honest, this isn't just intellectual information. This is life-changing, reality-shattering, worldview-destroying knowledge. If the Gnostics were right, then everything our civilization has built itself on is fundamentally mistaken. Our religions, our governments, our economic systems, our social structures, all of them are based on the assumption that the material world is real and that external authority is legitimate. But what if it's not? What if the Gnostics were right? That this entire world is a prison designed to keep divine consciousness trapped in ignorance? What if the authorities we've been taught to respect are actually agents of our spiritual captor? What if the salvation we've been seeking from external sources is actually available within ourselves? These aren't just philosophical questions, they're practical ones. Because if the Gnostic worldview is correct, then the spiritual crisis facing humanity isn't a moral failing that requires forgiveness from an external deity. It's a case of mistaken identity that requires awakening to our true nature. Think about it. What if the voice in your head that tells you you're not good enough, that you're inherently flawed, that you need to submit to external authority, what if that voice isn't coming from God at all? What if it's coming from the entity that the Gnostics identified as humanity's spiritual captor? What if the feelings of alienation and longing that characterize modern life aren't evidence of our fallen nature, but evidence of our divine nature? What if we feel like strangers in this world because we don't actually belong here? What if we're homesick for a realm of existence that we've forgotten, but that still calls to us from the depths of our consciousness? The Gnostic answer to these questions is both simple and revolutionary. You are not a fallen creature in need of salvation. You are a divine being who has temporarily forgotten your true nature. You don't need to be saved. You need to be awakened. But awakening isn't easy. It requires letting go of everything you've been taught to believe about yourself, about reality, about the nature of existence. It requires recognizing that the authorities you've been taught to respect may actually be the agents of your spiritual imprisonment. It requires accepting that the salvation you've been seeking from external sources is actually available within yourself. Most importantly, it requires recognizing that the God you've been taught to worship may not be God at all, but the very entity that is keeping you trapped in ignorance and fear. This is why the Gnostic path has always been for the few rather than the many. Most people aren't ready for this level of spiritual revolution. They prefer the comfort of external authority to the challenge of inner awakening. They'd rather be told what to believe than discover the truth for themselves. But for those who are ready, the Gnostic path offers something that no external religion can provide: direct access to the divine consciousness that is your true nature. Not as a reward for good behavior, not as a gift from an external deity, but as the recognition of what you have always been. The techniques are available. The ancient Gnostics developed sophisticated methods for achieving this awakening, and many of these methods have been preserved in the texts we've been discussing. Meditation practices that quiet the voice of the false self and allow the divine self to emerge. Visualization techniques that help you see through the illusions of the material world. Breathing exercises that connect you with the divine pneuma that is your true life force. But the most important technique is simply this: learning to question everything. Every belief you've been taught, every authority you've been told to respect, every assumption you've been conditioned to accept. Because according to the Gnostic texts, the prison of ignorance is maintained primarily through unquestioned belief in false authorities. This is why the Gnostic Jesus doesn't ask for your faith. He asks for your investigation. He doesn't demand your worship. He challenges your assumptions. He doesn't promise you rewards for obedience. He offers you tools for awakening. But he also warns you that this awakening will change everything. Once you see through the illusions of the material world, you can't unsee them. Once you recognize your own divine nature, you can't unknow it. Once you understand that the God you were taught to worship is actually your spiritual captor, you can't go back to the comfortable ignorance of orthodox religion. This is both the promise and the challenge of the Gnostic path. It offers ultimate freedom, but it requires ultimate responsibility. It provides direct access to divine consciousness, but it demands that you let go of all external spiritual authority. It reveals the truth about reality, but it forces you to question everything you've been taught to believe. And here's the most important part. This awakening isn't just personal. According to the Gnostic texts, every person who awakens to their divine nature contributes to the liberation of all consciousness from the prison of ignorance. Every individual who sees through the illusions of the material world weakens the power of those illusions. Every person who recognizes their own divine nature makes it easier for others to recognize theirs. This is why the Gnostic texts speak of the salvation of the all. Not salvation by an external deity, but salvation through the collective awakening of divine consciousness to its own nature. Not escape from the material world, but transformation of the material world through the recognition that it is not ultimate reality. Think about what this means for our current historical moment. We're living through a time of unprecedented spiritual crisis. Traditional religions are losing their authority. People are questioning institutional authorities in every area of life. There's a widespread sense that something is fundamentally wrong with the way our civilization is organized. The Gnostic interpretation suggests that this crisis isn't a sign of moral decay or spiritual failure. It's a sign of awakening. People are beginning to see through the illusions that have kept humanity trapped for millennia. They're starting to question the authorities that have claimed to speak for God. They're beginning to seek direct spiritual experience rather than accepting second-hand religious doctrine. This is exactly what the Gnostic texts predicted would happen. They spoke of a time when the divine sparks trapped in the material world would begin to awaken to their true nature. They described a process of collective liberation that would begin with individuals recognizing their own divine consciousness and would eventually transform the entire structure of reality. But they also warned that this awakening would be resisted by the powers that benefit from keeping humanity in ignorance. The institutional authorities that have built their power on spiritual dependence won't give up without a fight. The economics, systems that depend on people believing they are nothing more than material consumers, won't transform easily. The political structures that require people to submit to external authority won't welcome the recognition of inner divine authority. This is why the Gnostic path has always been dangerous. Not because it's false, but because it's true. Not because it leads to moral decay, but because it leads to spiritual liberation. Not because it undermines legitimate authority, but because it reveals that much of what we've been taught to consider legitimate authority is actually illegitimate. The question is, are you ready to take this risk? Are you prepared to let go of the comfortable certainties that have guided human civilization for centuries? Are you willing to consider that the most radical spiritual revolution in human history might be happening right now, and that you might be called to participate in it? Because that's what the recovery of the Gnostic texts really represents. Not just an interesting historical discovery, but a spiritual opportunity. Not just alternative interpretations of ancient religious texts, but practical tools for consciousness transformation. Not just intellectual knowledge, but the possibility of direct spiritual awakening. The texts are available, the teachings are clear, the techniques are described, the community of seekers is growing. The only question is whether you have the courage to step onto the path of gnosis and discover for yourself what the ancient Gnostics knew, that you are not a fallen creature in need of salvation, but a divine being who has temporarily forgotten your true nature. The prison doors are open. The only thing keeping you inside is your own belief that you belong there. The question is, Are you ready to walk out? The transformation has begun. The only question is whether you'll be part of it, or whether you'll continue to live in the comfortable illusion that has sustained humanity for centuries. The choice, as always, is yours. But remember this: once you've seen the truth, you can't unsee it. Once you've tasted freedom, you can't go back to accepting imprisonment. Once you've recognized your own divine nature, you can't pretend to be merely human. The Gnostic path is not for everyone, but for those who are ready, it offers the most precious gift imaginable: the recognition